The gavel struck. 3 sharp cracks that echoed through the marble halls of Congress like thunder. The chamber, already thick with tension, seemed to contract. Representative Jasmine Crockett stood at the witness table, her vibrant purple blazer a defiant splash of color. Then Speaker Mike Johnson's voice cut through the silence. "Congresswoman Crockett claims to be a woman of faith," he declared, "but her voting record stands in direct opposition to what the Bible actually teaches. I question whether she's reading the same scripture the rest of us faithful Christians follow, or if she's simply using God's name to baptize her progressive agenda." Gasps rippled through the gallery. This wasn't normal political sparring. This was an attack on the very soul of a sitting congresswoman. Johnson stood tall behind the speaker's rostrum, a leather-bound Bible beside his nameplate. His expression radiated confidence, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and withdrew her own Bible. Worn, dog-eared, its cover creased from years of use. She placed it on the table with a soft thud that echoed louder than the gavel. The entire chamber froze. Jasmine Crockett wasn't born into power. She clawed her way to it. At 43, the former civil rights attorney from Dallas had spent her career fighting battles that most politicians only talked about. But before she was a lawyer, before she was a legislator, she was simply Jasmine, granddaughter of Reverend Samuel Crockett. Her grandfather had pastored Mount Zion Baptist Church in St. Louis for 47 years. Every Sunday, Jasmine sat in the third pew, listening to him preach about justice, mercy, and walking humbly with God. By 15, she'd won 3 regional Bible knowledge competitions. Faith wasn't a political accessory for Jasmine Crockett. It was the bedrock of her identity. Across the ideological divide stood Speaker Mike Johnson. At 52, the Louisiana congressman had built his political brand on faith and constitutional law. He wielded Scripture like a sword, quoting verses in floor speeches, invoking biblical principles in policy debates, positioning himself as the moral conscience of the Republican conference. To Johnson, the Bible provided clear, unambiguous answers to America's problems. Today's hearing was supposed to address poverty relief legislation, Crockett's proposal to expand child nutrition programs. She'd opened her testimony by quoting James 2:14-17. "Faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." Johnson had countered with 2 Thessalonians 3:10, arguing for stricter work requirements. But then he crossed a line. He questioned her faith itself. What Johnson didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for this confrontation her entire life. "Congresswoman Crockett," Johnson began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you speak eloquently about compassion, but let's be honest about what your policies actually do. They create dependency, not dignity." His voice rose with theatrical indignation. Proverbs 19:17 says, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord." But that generosity should flow from individuals, from churches, not from Washington. Applause erupted from the Republican benches. He waited for it to die down, then delivered his knockout blow. "Congresswoman, you claim your policies are rooted in faith, but I believe your politics are twisting your faith. That's not conviction, that's convenience." The words hung in the air like an indictment. But Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly still. She opened her well-worn Bible. "Mr. Speaker," she said softly, "I appreciate your concern for my spiritual well-being. But before I respond, let's establish something from Scripture itself. Matthew 7:1-2 says, 'Do not judge, or you too will be judged.'" She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I have never questioned your faith, Mr. Speaker, so I find it interesting that you feel qualified to judge mine." Johnson's confident smile faltered. "Now, since you've opened this theological discussion," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "let's have it, with the full biblical witness. You quoted Proverbs about personal generosity," Crockett said. "And yes, individual charity matters. But the Bible doesn't stop there. She read clearly. Deuteronomy 15:11 says, "There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed." She looked up, her eyes blazing. That word, command, is important. In the Old Testament, God established entire systems to protect the vulnerable, laws requiring landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so the poor could eat, debt cancellation every 7 years. If those aren't government programs, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what is. She turned to another page. You cited 2 Thessalonians 3:10. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. But context matters. Paul was writing to believers who had stopped working because they believed Christ's return was imminent. That was a specific pastoral correction, not a universal blueprint for poverty policy. Crockett's voice rose with passionate clarity. And what about Acts 4:32-35? The early church shared everything they had. The scripture says there was not a needy person among them. Would you call that creating dependency, Mr. Speaker? Or would you call it living out the radical generosity Jesus commanded? Johnson cut in, his composure cracking. Congresswoman, that was voluntary sharing among believers, not coercive government taxation. Was it? Crockett asked calmly. Because when Ananias and Sapphira held back part of their wealth while pretending to give it all, God struck them dead. That sounds like there were serious communal expectations about economic sharing, doesn't it? Gasps echoed through the chamber. Even Johnson looked stunned. Crockett flipped to another dog-eared page. Mr. Speaker, you questioned whether I've actually read the Bible. Let me assure you, I have. Cover to cover, multiple times. She looked around the room. But here's the difference between us. I read all of it, not just the verses that fit comfortably into one political ideology. Johnson started to interject, but Crockett raised a gentle hand. When Jesus began his public ministry in Luke 4, he went to the synagogue and read from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free." Her voice rang with conviction. That was his mission statement. So tell me, how can we claim to follow Jesus while dismissing poverty as merely a personal failing? The atmosphere had completely shifted. What started as Johnson's attack had become Crockett's prophetic witness. You mentioned Romans 13 earlier, about government wielding the sword, but you stopped reading too soon. Just a few verses later, Paul says, "Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law." She looked directly at Johnson. Love, that's the fulfillment of the law. Not punishment, not restriction, love. Several members were openly nodding now. And since we're discussing Romans, Crockett went on, Romans 15:1 says, "We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves." Isn't that exactly what a robust social safety net does? Isn't that the strong supporting the weak? Which is precisely what Paul commands. Johnson finally found his voice. "Congresswoman, you're conflating personal ethics with government policy." "Am I?" Crockett interrupted gently. "Or did Jesus refuse to recognize that distinction? When he overturned the tables in the temple, he wasn't just upset with individual money changers. He was confronting an entire corrupt system that exploited the poor in God's name." Her voice rose with passion. He didn't say, "You men should be more personally generous." He drove them out. He disrupted the system. Because sometimes, Mr. Speaker, love requires disrupting systems that harm the vulnerable. The chamber was utterly silent. Crockett turned to another passage. Proverbs 31:8-9 commands us, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." She looked around with fierce compassion. "That's not optional charity, Mr. Speaker. That's a direct command. Speak up. Defend. Judge fairly. That's exactly what my legislation aims to do." Johnson's face had gone from irritation to resignation. "But Christianity has never belonged to one political party," Crockett said, her tone softening. "Throughout history, faithful believers have interpreted Scripture differently. William Wilberforce fought slavery by invoking biblical justice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer resisted Nazi tyranny. Martin Luther King Jr. marched for civil rights because his faith demanded it." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "People of genuine faith have always disagreed about how to live out Scripture in the public square. That's not weakness. That's the humility to recognize that none of us has a monopoly on God's truth." Then she closed her Bible and spoke the line that would be replayed 1,000,000 times. "My grandmother once told me something about the Bible." Crockett's eyes locked on Johnson's. She said, "Baby, the devil can quote Scripture too. The difference is in the heart behind the quoting." The chamber froze. "When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness," Crockett continued quietly, "Satan quoted Scripture, perfectly accurately. But Jesus answered with Scripture rightly understood, with Scripture interpreted through love, not control." She let the silence hold. "I don't claim perfect knowledge of the Bible, Mr. Speaker. None of us should. But I know this. Jesus didn't spend his time with the powerful. He walked with the poor, the sick, the outcast. He warned repeatedly about the spiritual danger of wealth. He commanded that we care for the least of these." Her final words landed like a benediction. So, any interpretation of Scripture that consistently benefits the powerful while harming the vulnerable? That reading deserves to be questioned. Not because I say so, but because Jesus did. Crockett placed her hand on her Bible and sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the applause came, not just from Democrats but from scattered Republicans, from the gallery, from staffers lining the walls. Speaker Mike Johnson sat motionless. A senior Republican aide quickly approached Johnson. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," Johnson announced, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. He didn't look at Crockett as he left. The moment he exited, the chamber exploded into conversation. One hot mic caught a veteran Republican congressman muttering, "Johnson made a massive miscalculation. You never challenge a black woman on Scripture, never." Outside, journalists swarmed Crockett. "Were you nervous going head-to-head with the Speaker?" "Nervous? No." Crockett's voice was gentle but firm. "The Bible doesn't belong to any political party. It belongs to everyone who believes. I grew up with those words. For me, this isn't performance. It's the foundation of who I am." Within minutes, clips flooded social media. Bible Showdown trended nationally. The video of her "The devil can quote Scripture too" line went viral. When the chamber reconvened, the atmosphere felt different. Johnson returned with a carefully neutral expression. "Let's return to the policy questions at hand," he said stiffly, but everyone could feel it. He was retreating. What followed was extraordinary. The debate continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Lawmakers on both sides began referencing Scripture not as a weapon, but as a source of shared moral reflection. For perhaps the first time in recent congressional memory, faith was being discussed as common ground rather than a partisan dividing line. Late that evening, Jasmine Crockett sat in her office. The lights of Washington glowed through her window. On her desk, her grandmother's Bible lay open to the Beatitudes. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her that faith without justice is empty religion. She thought about the moment she'd looked into Speaker Johnson's eyes and seen not an enemy, but another human being trying to be faithful. Today hadn't been about defeating Mike Johnson. It had been about defending the idea that God's love is wide enough for everyone, and that any theology that shrinks that circle must be resisted. Faith had been reclaimed as a language of compassion, not division, and that, she thought, might be the most important victory of all.